Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're putting on our constitutional expert hats and diving straight to the deep end. We are breaking down the legal boundaries between the president's powers and Congress, and we're going to do it by looking at a real, high-stakes case study, the legal mechanics behind the U.S.-Iran military conflict of early 2026. Look, the goal here isn't to talk politics. It's to figure out exactly how the law operates when the stakes are literally life and death. So let's just jump right in. Okay, let's dive into this. Check out this quote from our sources. Congress didn't even receive a note in the mail. Pretty wild, right? This hits the absolute core of the legal tension in the U.S. government. What actually happens when the executive branch just decides to launch military action and completely bypasses the legislative branch, the people's representatives? Well, that's exactly how what constitutional experts call a crisis begins. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the facts of the Iran conflict. Then look at the Constitution and the War Powers Resolution of 1973. After that, we'll dig into the legal loopholes presidents use, the tools Congress has to fight back, and finally, the fallout when the law just gets ignored. Let's start with Section 1, the Iran conflict scenario and Operation Epic Fury. Because to really grasp the legal theory here, we've got to ground it in the actual events of early 2026. Now, what's really interesting about the timeline of this conflict is how it all kicked off. On February 28, 2026, the U.S. and Israel launched a surprise attack. So the war actually began as a preemptive joint military campaign. It wasn't a response to some initial Iranian attack on U.S. soil or troops. It was only after these preemptive strikes that Iran started retaliating, firing missiles at bases in Qatar and Kuwait and shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. And eventually, that back and forth led to a really fragile conditional ceasefire in April. And that brings us to a massive legal question. Was there an imminent threat? Because despite that preemptive strike, closed-door Pentagon briefings to Congress actually confirmed there was zero intelligence suggesting Iran was planning to strike first. This is a crucial detail. Without an immediate, imminent threat, the legal justification for a president just acting totally solo shifts dramatically. Let's look at why that's the case. Moving to Section 2, constitutional separation of powers, or what's basically an inherent tug of war. To understand why that lack of an imminent threat is such a big deal, we have to look at the foundational laws of the U.S. The Constitution deliberately split war powers right down the middle. You've got Article I, which gives Congress the exclusive authority to actually declare war, plus they control the national purse strings. Then you have Article II, making the president the commander-in-chief of the military. It's an intentionally designed tug of war. Impartially speaking, the president can command troops to defend the country from a sudden attack, sure. But for a sustained offensive war, legally you absolutely need Congress to sign off on that. Which brings us to Section 3, the War Powers Resolution of 1973. Because the Constitution left some wiggle room, Congress stepped in after the Vietnam War to basically act as the legal referee. And this brilliantly illustrates the strict ticking legal clock that Congress set up. If a president strikes without prior approval, these rules instantly kick in. Within 48 hours, the president must formally notify Congress. From that exact moment, a 60-day countdown begins. If Congress doesn't formally declare war or specifically authorize the action within those 60 days, the troops have to pack up and come home. There is a 30-day optional extension, but that's strictly for safe troop withdrawal. It's a beautifully structured mechanism. Well, on paper, anyway. All right, Section 4, executive justifications and loopholes. Because theory is great, but how do modern administrations actually navigate around these strict rules when bullets are flying? Time to find that legal friction.
Presidents rely heavily on this specific concept, the imminent threat. If the executive branch can argue that a threat is so urgent that there's literally no time to consult Congress, they can constitutionally act unilaterally to defend the country. But, and here's the catch, that requires hard, factual backing from intelligence agencies. Let's clinically analyze the friction here in the context of 2026. The White House claimed there was an escalating, unacceptable threat, but official monitoring bodies pushed back hard. The IAEA saw no structured nuclear weapons program. The Defense Intelligence Agency stated Iran was at least a decade away from having missiles that could even reach the U.S. mainland. Sure, there were regional skirmishes, but experts agreed that didn't equal a direct impending strike on the United States. So the president's legal foundation for bypassing Congress was, frankly, pretty shaky. Let's move to and see how this builds, because when the facts don't quite support the law, the executive branch often gets creative with legal gymnastics. Step 1, they just redefine terms. They'll claim a massive campaign of targeted airstrikes isn't technically a war, so Congress isn't needed. Step 2, remember that ticking 60-day clock?
Administrations often argue that a temporary pause or a ceasefire, kind of like the one we saw in April, just magically resets the clock back to zero. And step 3, historical acquiescence. For decades, presidents have deployed troops without formal declarations, mostly relying on the fact that Congress usually just looks the other way.
But what if they don't look the other way? Section 5. How Congress can respond. Let's look at the arsenal Congress holds to actually rein in an executive acting without authorization.
Congress actually has a pretty robust toolkit here. They can pass formal joint resolutions to recall troops. They can repeal old military authorizations, known as AUMFs, to strip away the president's legal cover. They can even use subpoenas to grill officials publicly. But the absolute strongest, most definitive constitutional tool they have is the power of the purse. Congress can literally just refuse to pay for the war. By blocking funds in the annual defense budget, the NDAA, they legally choke off the oxygen required to sustain the military operation. So the crucial point is, even with these incredibly powerful legislative tools, there is a massive obstacle. If Congress passes a binding resolution to stop a war, the president still has to sign it. And naturally, a president who just started a military campaign is going to veto that bill. To actually override that veto, Congress needs a 2/3 supermajority in both the House and the Senate. That takes an unbelievable amount of unified political will across party lines. Which brings us to Section 6, legal consequences of defiance. What actually happens when an administration flagrantly ignores legislative boundaries and funding restrictions? Well, that's when we hit a full-blown constitutional crisis. Impartially speaking, the ultimate legal and political consequence here is impeachment. Ignoring funding laws or launching an illegal war can absolutely be classified by the House as high crimes and misdemeanors. Even if a conviction in the Senate is highly unlikely, the mere threat of impeachment is a heavy legal lever. It exerts immense political pressure and is often used by Congress to try and force an administration into a diplomatic retreat. Before we wrap up, I want to highlight this number for you, 326. That is the number of days the USS Gerald R. Ford was deployed during these escalating tensions. It was one of the longest sea assignments in half a century. And I think that really puts things into perspective. This isn't just dry legal theory debated in Washington. When executive actions stretch beyond statutory limits, it puts an enormous, real-world strain on military morale and the actual troops on the ground.
And that brings me to a final thought for you to chew on. We've seen how the law is designed, but we've also seen how it gets legally sidestepped. So, the big question is this. If historical precedent repeatedly overrules the written law, do our constitutional checks and balances even still exist in modern warfare? The 2026 Iran conflict proves that the battle for power is fought just as fiercely in the halls of government as it is on the battlefield. Keep questioning, keep digging into the facts, and thanks for joining me for this explainer. Catch you next time.